Welcome to Why Do You Do What You Do? Because how many of you have ever made the same mistake more than once? More than twice? How many of you have tried to change a habit or a behavior, and it seems like the harder you try, the harder it gets to change? Okay? How many of you have ever tried to motivate yourself to do something that you didn't really necessarily want to do, but needed to do? Okay. Well, how would you like to know why? Because how many of you consider yourself to be logical people? Okay, most of us do. And so you want to know the logic if somebody tells you to do something of what they're talking about, because otherwise they don't have any credibility with you, do they? It's kind of like, yeah, who do you think you are, you know? So what I want to do today is to actually take you through some of the steps of how not only that you motivate yourself, but also how you can motivate others, and to figure out what your character's motivations are. Because whether you're in doing animation, you're doing film, you may want to be a producer, it doesn't matter, director, whatever else it is, you need to know what that character is all about and why they're doing what they're doing. Well, the first character we really need to deal with is us. Because altogether, too often we go, oh, well, if you would, well, you know, if you would just. How many of you have ever heard those words come out of your mouth? If you just quit doing this, or if you just start doing this. And you know what? They don't change. It's not their job to change to meet your needs. Sorry about that, but not happening. They have no reason to. So if you want to help someone, that's a totally different picture. I believe in tools. And I know Brian talks a lot about that too. But you need to have the tools, though, to actually do the change. But you also need to know why that those tools are going to work and how they're going to work, what their purpose is, and where they fit in the greater scheme of things, or else they're just hot air blowing. Okay, and you've seen a lot of those. Well, you know, if you just try this. How many of you, when you were a kid growing up, well, if you just do it. And you looked at the parent or whoever else the adult in charge was and go, yeah, that works for you, but it doesn't work for me. I used to get in a lot of trouble for some of what to me were the dumbest things. And as an adult, I still think they were kind of dumb. I have a lot of physical anomalies, problems, and for instance, doing something as simple as turning a doorknob. Okay, a lot of people normally can do it like this. You know, they can just turn the knob. I have to literally take my hand around and do that to open a doorknob. I can't do it. I never know where my hand is truly directionally facing in space. You ought to see me trying to play tennis. You know, I think I've got that racket squarely out there. Oh no, it's this. So I've got that slice instead of a nice clear, because I don't have that picture. So my parents would say, well, if you would just do it right. Okay, what's your right doesn't work for me. And so even as young people, we learn, even as kids, we learn, yeah, that works for you, but it doesn't work for me. Don't you talk back to me. Any of you ever heard that one? Mm-hmm. You know, well, when it's you're on your own, you can have your own opinion, but until then, you don't have one. Any of you ever heard that one? Okay. Well, if you kind of take out your drawing, I'm going to take you on a trip. Okay, first thing I want you really to recognize, and many of you have heard this before, but I'm going to put it in context. Your brain is the most incredibly sophisticated computer you have ever seen. It is phenomenal, it is amazing, and it can do things that nothing else that has been created yet can do. And it's in a very small case. I mean, think about this. That's not a whole lot of stuff. And back when I first started teaching, when we were talking about this, the computer we would be talking about to do this would have been the size of a basketball court. Now I want you to think about that. A computer the size of a basketball court. Look how far we've come. I mean, we've got phones that do more than the first moonshot computer could do. But your brain is one of those incredible computers. And it records everything that you see, hear, experience, are a part of. It records everything. And it records it in the context. I want you to really get that word, in the context the information was laid down. Now the program for your computer, and I'm going to just kind of make it a little CD-ROM since those are kind of still used somewhat, although now it's more digital, but we need to have a visual, okay? The program that runs your computer is primarily programmed in the first 13 years of your life. Now think about that. And I'm going to work it backwards. So it's first 13. Okay. However, the most information goes in between 0 and 3. You learn more in that period of time. Think about it. You learn balance. You learn nuance. You learn language. You learn how to operate the body that the computer runs. And believe me, if you've ever had an orthopedic injury and had to relearn how to walk, as an adult, that is not easy. Okay? And so what you assimilate at such a high rate of speed in those first years is incredible. You learn how things are related, how things go together, what's important, what's not so important, what to value, what to ignore. And you learn the way that in the system you're in to get your needs met, because you are born with a drive to get your needs met. And if you can't get it met positively, you will get it met negatively, if that's what it takes. How many of you have ever seen the most obnoxious little brat running around and you want to choke them till their eyes pop out kind of a thought? Okay. That kid learned that if they're going to get any kind of feedback or attention, which is necessary for learning, that they're going to do whatever it takes. And that includes getting on their parents' one last nerve. Okay? Because at least I'll get a reaction out of you. I may not get a response, and there's a difference between response and reaction. If you say something and it's in an open, honest inquiry, you get a response. But if you say it with that attitude, you're likely to get a reaction. Okay? If you want to maintain the ability to keep your environment fairly balanced, I'm going to suggest that you work on developing the ability to elicit a response. Because reaction doesn't think. I want you to think about that. Reaction doesn't really think. It spews out at a high rate of speed. How many of you have ever tried to pull something back into your mouth after it's come out? Doesn't come, and that's a reaction. Somebody pushes that button, I mean, they get an immediate reaction. Okay, so 0 to 3 is the most important. 4 to 7 That's when you start developing your interactions with people. Okay, so how many of you have ever been on a playground and watched kids, you know, or if you have younger siblings, you'll already see the pecking order start to have developed on the playground. You can tell who's the bully. You can tell who they pick on. You can tell what's called the pecking order or the food chain. By the way, do you know where pecking order comes from? It's a chicken term. Okay, there's the alpha chick. Okay, and usually this is a hen. And she can peck any of the flock below her. Then the next one down can't go up, but can go down. Next one down, not up, until you get to the bottom of the pecking order. And that's the chicken usually that's pretty well plucked most of the time. Okay? And that's why it's called the pecking order. So it's where that person is on the playground is a real fast way of watching where the behavioral pieces are fitting in. And you'll see the one, and by the way, how many of you have ever said, well, I'm not a part of that? And yet, whether you recognize it or not, you are. Even if you kind of step off to the side, you're still a part of it. Okay? So this is all getting very heavily laid down in the 4 through 7. So how do I relate to my bigger world? And then 8 to 13, okay, pretty well closes out what I call the external programming. Now, that doesn't mean you won't be programmed anytime after that. If you don't believe it, listen to politics or radio commentators or media, because you know you're getting programmed 24/7 there by whoever has the most bucks. But anyway, if you look at that, the first 13, and that's what's called true childhood, by the way. And in almost every culture, the end of childhood is age 13. The Jewish, that's the Ba and the Bar Mitzvah. And the Christian tradition, that's when the sacraments, when you're actually considered to be old enough to join the church, okay? Vision quests happen at 13 in the native communities, and if you go virtually through any culture, 13 marks the end of childhood, but the beginning of what's called true adolescence, okay? So 14 through 26 are true adolescents. Ever wonder why that driver's license, or car insurance for males goes down dramatically after age 26? That's why. Because adolescence is by nature the period when you look at what you don't want to try and figure out what you do want. But from that point on, you're the only person in charge of what goes in and what you're going to let go in. Even though you're still at home, you're still under those rules, that's also the period when you start seeing the separation. Because even if you've been in a really close situation with your family, that sometimes is even harder to break away from than a family you can't wait to get away from, because you've been so close, and yet there's that point where you have to emancipate yourself from the identity as a child and start to develop, okay, now who am I going to be? And it is proactive. Now the interesting thing is, from 14 on, you are the only one who can change your program. Now, I want you to loud and clear hear me. Everybody in here is above 14, right? Okay. Then if you don't like what's going on in your life, no one can do anything for it except for you. You're the only one that can change it. As you change it, though, you start to then design who you are going to become. And if you got holes in it, if you got parts where, you know, you've had stuff go on, and we'll talk more about that in a little bit, when you've had those things go on, you're the only person that can rewrite your script. And think of it that way. You're the only person that can re-script you. I can sit here and tell you until I'm purple in the face how awesome, incredible. I can tell you, I could sit here right now from just what I've seen of those of you in Brian's class, I can sit here and tell you at least 10 or 15 of your top gifts and talents. And many of you would be hard-pressed to do the same because you don't recognize them. They're in your blind spot. Plain as a nose on your face. And everybody can see it but you. Okay? So your job is to figure out what's in your blind spot. So here's how, and this is why it's so powerful. Okay? You have two brains that operate. And the first one, and this is very heavily laid down in those first 7 years, is what I call the snake brain. That's the reptilian brain. But for want of a better term, I'm really going to put it down to snake. It is pure survival. That's its goal, to get my needs met so I can survive in the environment I'm in. And I'm going to do anything it takes to survive because that's that inborn need. And so if I need food, if I can't get it one way, I'll scream, I'll howl, I'll whine, I'll do whatever it takes. If I need touch, and by the way, the touch need is huge. If a child does not have enough of that touch need met in those early years, a lot of times those are the ones that develop the attachment disorder. You know, they're the ones that haven't had that, so they don't have anything they're really bonded or attached to. And that's why that is so important. It really does cause long-term. But the other need a child has is feedback. They did a lot of surveys back when programs like Sesame Street and Electric Company first came out. They were the beginning of all the child programs. One of the big things people would do is, oh, they teach all of this really good stuff. They teach the numbers, they teach the letters, they teach the words. Let's park our kids in front of the television. We're going to do them so much good. If you learn a word, but you don't get the feedback of saying it and hearing and seeing the response when you say it, the word doesn't hardwire. You can regurgitate and repeat it, but you really don't internally own the word. So a person can have a vocabulary that is not a functional vocabulary. They know the words, and how many of you have seen kids that can sing every commercial jingle and have no idea what on earth they're talking about because even though it's in that, they haven't internalized it. But when kids get the feedback by, you know, is it quiet? Yes, it's quiet. What do you mean by quiet? Think about that. How do you get that concept? Or I'll give you the really good one. I want everyone in here to don't think the color red. What was the first thing you thought?
Red, blue.
What was the first thing else? What's the first thing you thought?
Blue, just the color.
Uh-huh. And what a lot of times will happen is many people will think red if they're not being reactive, okay? They will think red because don't is an abstract. Okay, I want you to tell me how you don't something. You. Tell me how you don't something.
I honestly don't. I don't know.
Thank you. You're absolutely right, and the look on your face says it all. Ah, because you can't don't something. How do you don't without a do? So you got to have do first. And thank you for being such a good sport about being put on the spot and going, oh,
Yeah, I wasn't expecting.
yeah. Yeah, it's like you pull a blank because we don't. It's a totally, and even today, how many of you, if somebody tells you don't you dare do that, will automatically do it just because somebody told you don't do it? Hello, let's go through adolescence. It really hits heavily there. Now, don't you stay out late. Don't you do this. Don't you do that. Don't. Okay? What you've just given me. Because we don't even, see, we're adults. A child does not develop the abstract ability even in the beginning stages until about 8 or 9 years old. So there is no there's no concept for abstracts. So if you say to a kid with something very enticing sitting right in front of them, and you say, don't touch that, what they hear is what?
Touch it.
Touch it. And they do. And then you scream even louder and say, I said don't touch that. And they hold on for dear life. And then you scream it again. And they go running up and down the hall celebrating that they're touching that. And then you turn around and you say, you are the most bullheaded child I've ever seen. You ignore everything I say. And so you're programming that same child to do exactly the opposite of what you think you're saying. And then they get in trouble for doing exactly what you said. Now I'll tell you what's fun. Try and go through the day without using some form of don't. Try and get through a day without it. Whoa! So anyway, the snake brain is all built on survival. That's primarily the first. That's food, fight, flight, frustration. I call them all the F words, including the procreation one, if you want to throw that in. That's all basic survival. And those are inborn traits. Then, the next part of the brain that gets laid down is the mammalian, aka I call it the dog brain, okay? Because that's your pack mentality. And believe me, you are a pack. Now the person I was kind of alluding to earlier, the person that says, oh no, I'm not part of them, still has defined themselves by their distance and direction from the pack. So even the loner is affiliated with the pack. Okay? Now think about that. So our pack needs are met, and that's that communication, that's that expression. Those are the needs that we get the next. Now, this includes everything you saw, felt, heard, or experienced in those primarily first 7 years. So that is programming everything that happened. Okay, so I've been talking external, now you take that internally. What you experienced in your first 7 years is what laid down your initial programming. And incidentally, that's also when your values are laid down. And your values are your hot buttons. They're also your touchy-feely buttons. They're your getting your needs met buttons. So values are the things that literally motivate and drive you, okay? And that's laid down in those first years in terms of how to get your needs met. Now, here's the beauty of it. It gets into what's called an autopilot, okay? So this program controls between 95 and 98% of your reactions, responses, thoughts, and ways of dealing with things. And being on autopilot. It's unconscious. You don't even know it's there. It's all in your blind spot. It's as plain as the nose on your face, but you don't see it. So when you meet or encounter any situation, this is meant to keep you alive, surviving. So it processes millions of pieces of information in a nanosecond. If it did not do so, most of you'd be dead. Let's just take your automobile. Okay, how many of you drive? Okay, stick or automatic?
Stick.
Automatic.
Okay, now for those of you that drive stick, okay, how many of you have ever gotten in the car after you got fluent with driving and tried to think the process of shifting your gears? In a stick, and you stop and think, okay, I need to turn the key on, I need to have my foot on the clutch, press it in, shift it into low.
It's an algorithm now.
Yes, it's all in this autopilot. And if you try and stop and think it through, and for those of you that drive a stick, when you leave here today, try and think your processes for actually starting your car and taking off. I guarantee you that if you don't kill it, you'll have some really unpleasant stuff, because it is, wait a minute, you're messing with me. It'll go nuts, okay? And all of that is so that you can do these things without even having to think. How many of you have ever been in a near wreck? And how you survived it, you have absolutely no idea. Okay, what your mind did is it literally replayed every driving episode you've ever been through in your entire life. And in that nanosecond, before you can get the words, oh, out of your mouth, okay, it has already determined the best option for you to survive. And it dictates whether you cut the wheels, whether you keep them straight, it has dictated how much brake you put on, or do you steer into it. I mean, it was snowing for me on the way up this morning. You know, I was like, hello, slip sliding away, aren't we? Okay. But having driven enough in snow, you know, my automatic is just, okay, ease off and steer straight. And then catch it. Yes?
Is it possible to turn off this part of the brain?
Not real easily, because it is so powerfully. The better part is, in times, is to reprogram it. You won't turn it off. And you actually brought me up to the next point, which I get to do a thank you. This works if your desire is to stay alive. A long time ago, back when the Silicon Valley made its first big nosedive, all of a sudden there were a group of people that were dying in car wrecks who had similar professions or similar passions. The professions were people with a lot of extensive math or engineering backgrounds, and the other people were also in that field, but were also good pool players. Now, what on earth does that have to do? Well, they also were people who, when they lost their jobs, which had been making multi-bucks, and you know, if you commit suicide, your family don't get no insurance, okay? So what they did, unconsciously, thinking, I'd be better off dead. And if they could not face the horrendous, overwhelming feelings of failure, you know, they lost the desire to live. And there was a spate of accidents in which the same kind of incidents that you would have steered away from, They were, and why the pool player? Who can guess why it would be the pool player also?
They live a life of precision.
Okay, but think, it's a very simple, it's angles. What is the angle? Because in an accident, what would compute the angle of this vehicle at this velocity, at this speed, banking and hitting what to create what? Now that's how sophisticated your mind is it can come up with incredible options. And so if the option is I'd be better off dead, when that dog runs across the road, the same dog that would run across the road for someone else, instead of your brain trying to keep you alive, your brain is looking for a way to keep you dead because you programmed it. So that's a reprogramming. Now sometimes, and that wasn't a conscious, it was and it wasn't. It was a conscious wish that was honored, but if you play it over often enough that I'd be better off dead, I'd be better off dead, I'd be better off dead, my family would be better off if I was dead, that becomes a new program. And that's the beauty also of the brain, is you can reprogram it, okay? You can reprogram it from old processes. Now, here's the interesting thing. So anywhere from 2 to 5% of the time, you're conscious. The rest of the time, you're running on pure autopilot, and even the conscious is still influenced by the unconscious, okay? Your job is to change and become, number one, more conscious, more aware. Catch yourself doing things. How many of you do negative self-talk? Okay, that negative self-talk is making sure your brain is hardwired and programmed to create the outcomes you repeat. How many of you are worriers? Okay, you're saying an affirmation every time you worry. You are affirming, oh my God, this is going to happen. Oh, okay, you are affirming that. You're creating this. Keep your mind where you want it and consciously reprogram your brain. And you can do it. That's a beauty. Hitler learned it beautifully. Look at what he managed to create in Germany way back then when. He created people who did things that they would never have thought they were capable of doing. And we can play into that. That's where the media is in many instances today, is it's into that same kind of thing. And because it is so constantly playing in the background, so it doesn't even have to be in front of it, it can be playing in the background. We don't see it, but we internalize it. Now, your values are going to change. As you get something that bumps up against one of them, you're going to choose, no, I don't like that about myself. I want to choose to change that. And life experiences will change you. But understand, this is why you keep doing the same things and expecting different outcomes. Does that kind of make sense? Good. Because once you own this, okay, your job is to make the changes. Okay? Yeah, it's hard. Yeah, it's a challenge. And yeah, you have to catch yourself. And you also have to admit, oh dear, I could also be wrong. But what are you going to do about it? You're going to let it own you, or are you going to own it? All right, so what I'm going to take you into now is I'm going to lead you off this, but you're going to need to understand this, because this is your foundational piece. And there are 4 archetypes that we all have in common. And an archetype is a universal pattern that when we talk about it, we can pretty well identify with it. If I say, oh, he's such a jock, You know, you got a picture of what that's like, or, you know, we've got 1,000,001 terms that we use, some positive, some negative for people. So these are the terms. Now, the work of Caroline Myss, and that's M-Y-S-S, for any of you that really want to do some pretty decent exploration. Caroline Myss probably has done more with archetypes than anyone in recent history. And she's a fascinating person. She is, among other things, a military historian. She's also been a publisher. She's also been a lot of different things, and among her gifts is she's a medical intuitive. And I'm going to stretch your imagination. She could be at her place back in Boston, and she worked with a doctor that was in Springfield, Missouri. And he would call her up and say, Caroline, I have this woman in my office. Her name is, she's this. And Caroline would give these images of what she saw, and her accuracy rate was higher than most medical testing. She could tell, but she would use symbology in terms of, you know, one time she described it as someone having like concrete in their throat. Doctor ran tests, cancer in her throat. You know, so she would give interesting analogies, but it would tell him where to look and what to look for. And quite often it was in the precancerous stages. Okay, so she's a fascinating woman. She's got her PhD in religion and studies from, I think it's the University of Chicago, but just a totally fascinating person. But she's the one that really came up with the archetypal patterns. And she says there's 4 basic teaching archetypes. And so that's what we're going to hit on today. Okay? Now the first archetype is the child. Okay? Now we've just been talking about that child. And most kids, unfortunately, adapted out based on their family of origin and what I call the adults in charge in their life to do whatever it took to get their needs met. So kids adapt out. Some kids become fixers. I worked with CPS. They would bring me in when they were going to do a removal a lot of times to work with the kids who were being removed, especially when there were adults in the household. In this one particular household, there were 9 adults in various stages of, shall we say, inebriation? Be nice, okay. I could call it otherwise. And there were 5 or 6 kids, younger than this girl, who was 5 years old. Now this 5-year-old was taking care of the younger kids and the drunk adults. Who was the adult in charge in that household? That 5-year-old kid. So sometimes it can be a kid that's the adult in charge. But it's whoever is responsible. Oh, and by the way, that kid, that 5-year-old, was also cooking for the adults, bringing food, beer, wine, whatever. Okay? At 5. So early on. Now she basically, luckily we caught it at a good time, and she went into a therapeutic program while her parents were in treatment. And even though she was 5 years old, she did retain the role all through her life as a fixer. And so in her community today, she's the one that's in charge of all the health care for the individuals in her community because she loves making sure everybody's needs are met. Hardwired in at 5. Okay, that's her pack role. And even though she dealt with a lot of the grief, anger, and everything else, that part was really hardwired for her because that was where she got her rewards. Okay, so the child adapts, and some adapt into being that obnoxious little you-know-what that you see running around in the grocery store and you go, hey, yeah. All right. Next great teacher is the victim. Okay. And yeah, I haven't met a person yet that has not in some form or another been victimized by everything from, with me, my disabilities that I had. It can be race, it can be gender, it can be any number of things. But you end up with someone pointing their finger and going, you are, you know. And a lot of times the victimization can be very damaging. A lot of us take a lifetime to get over it. Now, generally, when we move into that next stage, and this is what I was telling you even on the playground. You have the victim and the victimizer, okay? Now, neither can survive without the other. Get that one straight, right on. Neither can survive without the other, okay? And what they do is they both blame the other one for being their trigger. So the victimizer blames the victim for being such a wimp, such a wuss, such a, you know, if you ever had, you know, any backbone, any guts, any, you know. And the victim goes, but if you just have that, okay. Both are blaming, which means neither has to change. Now let me say that again. This is really cool. Because as long as I can blame you, I'm not responsible for doing anything about mine. And vice versa. I knew a couple. He drank because she kept a messy house. Why do you think she kept a messy house?
Because he drank?
Because he drank, yes, absolutely. And neither of them wanted to give up theirs. She didn't want to do no housework. And he didn't want to quit drinking. And so they had that dance forever. And by the way, that's part of the cycle of violence. And let's put it this way. Think of it as a balance beam. I'm sitting here pointing my finger at you, and you're sitting and pointing your finger at me, and neither of us has to change. Yes?
But what need does this, what need of theirs is this satisfy to be able to keep a messy house and to not stop drinking? Like, why don't they just change? What need does it satisfy?
Because the person that keeps a messy house, very frankly, may not like keeping house. That may be boring, tiring, dull. Yeah. And if you ever ask a person why they drink, they can give you a litany of reasons they drink. If you ask them to give you a reason to stop, they go, I haven't got one. Why should I? It's not hurting anybody. It's not bothering me. I'm not drinking that much. See, we're in denial of what's in our blind spot. Okay, so we've got this dynamic that goes on. But one day, luckily, one of them gets their stuff together a little bit and says, hey, enough, I'm not doing this anymore. I am tired. Enough, I'm not doing it. And they start to move to center. And so let's say it's this one. Now, if I'm moving to center, think about being on a teeter-totter. When somebody starts going to center, what happens to this one? Yeah, they fall. Okay. So that person has one of two choices. They either have to go to center if they choose to maintain whatever that relationship is, or fall off the end of the teeter-totter. Now, unfortunately, what often happens here, we're so afraid that person's going to fall off that we don't do what we really need to do for us because we're so afraid. And that leads into one of our others in a minute. So anyway, if this person moves all the way, and I'm going to call it standing here dead center, okay, if I'm in the middle, that other person has one of two choices. I'm balanced here. You can do whatever you want. If you go down, that's yours. If you come to meet, that's yours. You know, we can work this out. But I am clearly balanced. And when that person has owned and internalized that balance, instead of here being the victim or the victimizer, this is the lesson. They become the victor over their fear, over their fright, over their terror, out of their belief that it won't work. That's what it's meant to teach you. It's to get you off stuck and into ownership of your own purpose and your own choices. And at the point you do this, you're not blown away and pushed off balance by other people's attitudes and behaviors. Okay? My greatest gifts were only honed when they went through the crucible. That was what developed the strength and the ability. And if those hadn't happened, it would have been a half-assed gift instead of a full-blown, functional, usable one. So I want you to think about that. That's the purpose in this. It's actually to bring you to your greatness, not to your knees in, abject servility. It's to bring you to where you go, I own me. Not going there anymore. Okay, next great teacher. Is the prostitute. And again, yeah, the prostitute, and on the other balance are the pimp and or the John. Okay? Now, when you sell yourself out, and I really want you to hear that because you're in a field where it happens more than almost any other field, is in the arts and in all this area of communication you're in. That is where the prostitute most often sells out. I'll do anything to get accepted. I'll do anything. I will. And what we do is we tend to sell ourselves short. Okay? I want you to really think about that. We sell ourselves short. Instead of giving us the full glory we've got, and man, you do. I'm sitting here looking at so much talent. If I wanted to produce something, you guys, just with what I've watched you this morning and with what you've said, oh man, would I take you in a heartbeat. Okay? Because you've got that much raw talent here. But if you don't recognize it, it's worthless. So with the prostitute, when you sell yourself out, you say, oh, I sort of did an okay job. Well, yeah, I kind of, you minimize, you discount, you're pimping yourself out. Okay, you're selling out. And if you give in, give up, give over, rather than to meet that passion that's living in you, that is way too much loss. Way too much loss. The John is the one that expects you to. You are going to give in to me, you're going to meet my needs, you're going to cater to my whims, and if you don't, you're out the door, kind of an attitude. Yes? Yep.
How do you balance that? And like, we can't all be Madonna, we can't all be Stevie Wonder, right? We can't all be
show you.
CEOs.
Yeah.
Okay.
Good question, because that's where we're going. You see, when you own your talent, okay, and you have the talent, and I'm going to nail you right here. You've got an incredible talent for looking at both sides of things, and you do a 360 automatically before you ever even open your mouth. You're looking at how this impacts that and does that. And it drives you nuts, because when you don't see other people being able to do it, you're going, what's wrong? Okay? And so you're looking at the positive, negative, easy. So here's where we're going with this. Rather than to sell out your dream, you go for your dream in doing the best you can at what you do. It may not be being Madonna, but it might be your dream is to be really communicating and expressing that kind of passion to where that people are drawn in. So look at what's really behind the behind. Okay? No, you may not be a Madonna. But if you were the best at what you are you not pretty happy at that? If you're the number one at what you do, whatever it is, and you're only comparing with you. See, we get hooked into comparing it with everybody else. Well, I don't have this like that person, I don't have that like that person, and I'm not the, you know. So we downplay, and that's when we get back into our victim role, is we tend to underplay what we've got. And we tell ourselves we're not good enough, and so we never achieve what we actually have as potential when we keep repeating the not good enough. But when you begin to own, and it's the same teeter-totter, doesn't matter which side you're on, if you recognize you've been pimping yourselves out, okay, and here's how it looks in your industry one way. You undersell, undervalue, underappreciate, and under-own what your talent actually is. Okay? You minimize it. You discount it. You put it down. And you are usually your worst critic. And when you criticize, it's remembered so much more clearly than when you acknowledge. And I will tell you that the average person criticizes themselves 14 times for every positive statement they make about themselves. Now just think about how often you beat up on yourself. That's it. And that's when you do it. So if you don't value you, you place the price on yourself. So when you own this one, you own your worth and value. And oh, folks, biggest way that translates is in dollars. Because if you unconsciously undervalue, declare yourself not to be worth that much on that self-talk, you have just told everyone how to treat you. That you have no value and you have no worth. Story on me. I grew up with two very bright parents who had some very good things going for them in their field, but who were also very highly abusive, and it could go downhill from there. So I grew up having been told repeatedly that I was as worthless as the tits on an old boar hog, or I'd never amount to a hill of beans. I heard that constantly. That became my hardwired program. That and quite a few other things that I was told, because that was how it happened back then. And anyway, I went through a lot of processes to make changes in myself. And I had gone through a couple of bad relationships and had really gotten my act together. And a guy that I had dated years ago asked me out. And so we went out. God, what a nice guy. He used to be such a jerk, was what went through my mind. God, he was a, you know. And so we went out 3 or 4 times, and I turned around to him one evening when he was dropping me off. And I said, God, you have changed so much. You used to be, I mean, you treated me like a crud. And he had a real thoughtful look on his face, and he looked for the longest time. And he looked. And Jack said, no, Judae, I've always treated you just the way that you treated you. My jaw dropped. Let me tell you something, that really hit home, because he was so right. And I was so blessed that he was so honest. To not candy coat it, but just to say. And I thought about it, and it's like, yeah, I did treat myself that way. So when you change, you also change the way other people respond to you. And if I know I am the best me at what I do, now notice I wasn't saying anybody else. I was saying the best me at what I do. Because you might do something exquisitely well that parallels, has a lot of similarities, but it also has your flavor, your nuance, your history, your biography, and your biology. And so it's uniquely you. And we are not exclusive. It doesn't mean either or. And that's the other thing. It can be both and. So when you do that come to center, it means you recognize the worth, but you also don't put anybody else down either. You value them, and you can see their talent. That's the difference. You value them for their unique, and you value you for your unique. And I'll tell you what, you develop a lot more people you have value for when you can value yourself. Ooh, that's cool. Last great teacher, and many of you know him very, very well. Okay. So the saboteur is your next teaching archetype. Now the saboteur is hardwired again, and it's part of that autopilot. So the way that it plays out, its opposing partners, and I'll show you how this works in a minute. Its opposing partner are, there's the sabotaged, who parallels in with the prostitute, who parallels in with the victim, and the adapted child. The two partners over here are the saboteur. That's when you do it to you. Not that we ever do that. But how many of you are more afraid of success than you are of failure? That is a huge, huge difference. Most people think, oh, I'm afraid of failing. You know, no, you're afraid of succeeding, because then you would have to fully step up to the plate and be fully engaged. And most of us are content to give half attitudes. Okay? We're content to do that, because that way we won't be judged. A long time ago, first day of class, I used to give my students a paper that they were to write, and this was in a semester program, so they got plenty of time. The topic was their choice. It didn't matter. It just had to be something they're passionate about. Oh dear. Okay. Now, there's one group that would immediately do everything they could the first week, and they would get that paper almost written. 10-page paper. Pretty comprehensive. There were people who would wait until literally the night before to write the paper, because they needed the push, the shove, the okay, because they were more willing to take a B+ than to have started at the beginning when they could have had an A+, because they didn't want to be judged and found lacking. So this gave them an excuse. Oh, I forgot about it and I didn't do it until the last minute. Beautiful cop-out, isn't it? Yes.
How does that tie in with the general, at least in America, if you're intelligent, you're ostracized. So how does this tie into that concept?
Well, it ties in beautifully, because many of, and I've worked with the full range of intellects, from some of the brightest that we've got to literally the profound in institutions. And we are so hypnotized into not standing out in a way that we can be measured, but we're willing to stand out and act the fool in ways that really aren't measured to us. So we can do something absolutely obnoxious or idiotic and be really good at it, but we don't mind that judgment. But if we are really striving to be our best at something we're really passionate about and we don't measure up, it is that fear of not measuring up to what we set for ourselves. And yet, we don't believe our capacity. Now, I want you to think about that. We don't believe in our capacity. And by the way, often the brightest and best in our schools are the ones that the teachers hate. Now, I want you to think about that. Why would that be?
They always make the teachers think.
Yes! And they get outside of the teacher's comfort zone. And they ask questions, and they make observations, and they do things that the teachers are not prepared for, because most teachers, to really succeed in what teacher training puts them through, is to be able to rote regurgitate, right, wrong, good, bad, the standard that we're teaching to, rather than to teach us to think. And we're not taught to think. We're taught to regurgitate on cue, to an expectation. I mean, look at all the silly, and I'm going to say it, I'm an educator, and the testing is absolutely silly. Other countries, they test once every 4 years. Of course, it counts for something then. But they know it counts for something, and they know that what it counts for is what you get to do next. So they have a reason to choose to succeed. And I was lucky enough at one point in time in my career to have what was called American Field Service. That used to be the exchange students. And I had one from Finland, and I was also the counselor for all of those kids, because they were in for major culture shock. And they came from all over the world. And it was fascinating, because many of them had already had 3 years ago what our seniors were having, but they also had those tests throughout the world, only about 4 in their career. But those counted as to what they got to do next. So they were motivated. Okay, what do you want to do with the rest of your life? So you're motivated to do well on your tests, so you got to opt into what you wanted to do. And Pirko wanted to go into medicine. Now at 18, she had already toured the continent once, and her parents weren't wealthy. She had saved the money up. She had also gone to Sweden and worked in a medical clinic in Sweden for a summer before she came to the US. Look at her background compared with the average high school student who hasn't had those opportunities. Okay, but they knew what they had to do to be able to go to their next step. So we tend to sabotage ourselves so often because we don't want anyone judging, and we judge more harshly, really, than anyone else does, in our fear of being judged. Well, then they'll think this, or they'll, and we mind game ourselves horribly. The other I call the sabotager. That's the person who envies you and what you have. And so they will do everything they can to sabotage you. Now, let me explain one other dynamic about all of these in our teeter-totter. We co-create. Put that term down. We co-create the dramas and dances with people. So how many of you have said, I need to be better at developing my patience? Have you ever said that? Okay. I guarantee you, if you've said that often enough, you will co-create the person that gets on your one last nerve and plays it like a violin, that you have absolutely no patience with. Because how do you know whether or not you have patience unless you're tested? So you co-create the lesson. And by the way, mistakes are lessons in dirty clothes, okay? So get over your bad selves about, oh, I don't want to make a mistake. Then you're going to be stagnant for the rest of your life. So we co-create the best teachers for the lessons we most need to learn. And we then co-create the dramas, we co-create the scenes to learn it. So that person that finally gets you to say, enough, I'm not doing this anymore, that is your greatest teacher for what you most need to learn in that area of your life at that point in time. And without them, you wouldn't have the chance to move forward. And by the way, when you start learning your lessons, I guarantee the tests will amp up dramatically. Because how do you know? What does Brian have you doing here all the time? Practice. When you make a mistake, what does he immediately turn it into?
A lesson.
Absolutely, it's a lesson. Okay, you learn it then because you see how it applies in context. You see what happens if you continue this and what can happen. Okay, that's where we learn from. We don't learn. Most of you are really not good at rote regurgitation. Okay, you don't memorize and spit it out. You're thinkers. Okay, so if you're going to learn it, you've got to experience it. And after you've experienced it, then you'll usually get called to teach it. Whether it's to a friend, a colleague, a child, even a parent sometimes. Because when you get to have to explain it, or demonstrate it, or make it real for someone else, oh, do you learn it better. That's why my education, and I got a bunch of it, I've got postdoctoral studies, okay? That is not my education. Those are pieces of paper, okay? And I call myself a highly paper-trained puppy when it comes to that. My education has been Every student I've ever had. They have been my best teachers because they told me what I didn't know. Now think about that. They told me what I didn't know.